Hello, my name is Justin Wise, and I have been a cybersecurity intern at RPG Corporation for the last 8 weeks. Throughout this internship, I have been tasked with a few things: configuring and securing the RPG network, performing vulnerability analysis, and creating a security report documenting all of my findings, remediating any vulnerabilities that I did find, so that RPG knows that the certain things that they need to adjust or secure within the environment is taken care of, and those certain things are laid out well. So when we go to expand to other areas like Denton, Texas, for the new manufacturing firm, or overseas, we know the security controls that have to be in place in order to keep the company's data safe and protected against threats. So let's get down to it here. The first task, configuring and securing the RPG network. So as you can see here on my screen, we have the LAN network. So we have a Windows server, Windows workstation, and an Ubuntu Linux workstation. We also have a Kali security workstation for testing purposes, scanning purposes, that sort of thing. We have a pfSense firewall, and then we have a Ubuntu web server out in the DMZ. So the first thing that I had to do with securing this network, I installed the web server software. So I installed Apache 2 on the web server, and I set up a static IP address using NetPlan on this web server host in the DMZ. I had to configure this using the pfSense firewall as well, to make sure that everything was working smoothly. I could access the internet, and it was secure. All the traffic was running through the firewall. I then set up a static IP address on the Windows server. So you can see proof of accomplishing that task here, as well as a static IP on the Linux workstation. Everything else, so the security workstation and the Windows workstation, were using DHCP. So I made sure that both of those hosts were configured appropriately. The next thing was creating users and security groups. So I did this within group policy on the Windows server. So I created security groups for the following departments: HR, R&D, IT, accounting, sales, and support staff. So after I was done creating those security groups, I created one unique user per each security group. And after I connected, first and foremost, I connected the Windows workstation to the domain controller to the RPG intern to make sure that those two systems were talking to one another. So the user naming convention that I used was the first initial and last name at rpg.internal. So for each one of these users, it might be a little small on my screen. That was the naming convention that I used for those folks. So I added the appropriate user to the appropriate security group to make sure that they were only able to access the specific documents, file shares, things like that. The only information that was privy to that specific department that user was a part of. The file shares that I created them on the C drive on the Windows server, created a folder for each of those departments, and then assigned the appropriate permissions. So the users were allowed to read the documents that were in that specific file share for their department. And then, as you can see here as a little proof, I logged in. This user was a domain admin that I created. So they had access to everything, but I wanted to make sure they were a part of this specific security group first. And they were able to map the file share and access the documents that would be in this file share because they were a part of, in this example, the IT department. The next thing I created was group policy objects and the appropriate settings. So within group policy, I looked at creating a password policy. There is a number of different things. So a complex password, 14-character minimum, things of that nature, an auditing policy. So we were monitoring all the log files going in and out for each user so we can collect all of that data for the internal blue team to monitor all those sorts of things for a potential nefarious activity or employees trying to access things that they didn't have permissions to access. Windows update settings, firewall settings, specific things for each user to make sure that their workstation was hardened to the best of the abilities. I ensured that RDP was allowed from the Windows workstation to the Windows server specifically. I set up firewall rules here on the Windows server to make sure that that was accurate. I also specifically configured certain things on the firewall to allow only the Linux workstation to access the web server via SSH. So I used firewall rules, as you can see here, only allowing port 22 traffic from the Linux workstation to the web server. And then I configured multi-factor authentication. I believe I have that in here. Maybe not, but I did configure multi-factor authentication from using the Google Authenticator app from the Linux workstation to the web server when a user tries to SSH into the web server to make changes. The second task was scanning for vulnerabilities. So I did this using Nmap. Down here, a little technical summary here. You can see my specific Nmap script that I use. So I use the vuln script, T4 for speed, a little bit of faster scan. -A, looking for the specific operating systems, versions, any sort of OS information that I could get from each machine, accomplishing my scans, and then a stealth scan as well. So you can see here my results from the Nmap scan. I will skip past this. You can see some vulnerabilities here that I'll touch on in just a second. So the top vulnerabilities found on the LAN network. So we're looking at the Windows workstation, the Linux workstation, and the Windows server. I only found vulnerabilities on the Windows workstation. So it was with port 80, the version of Apache that was running was vulnerable to a couple of different attack methods. But all in all, this was an out-of-date version of Apache that needed to be addressed. And that was the only vulnerability that I found. I did a lot of research here. One thing that everyone suggested was just to update to the latest version of Apache in order to mitigate these specific vulnerabilities. I also completed malware scans on the LAN network. On the Linux workstation, I did not find any infected files using ClamScan or ClamAV. With the Windows server and the Windows workstation, I used Byte Scanner, I believe it's called. And I did not find any vulnerabilities on the Windows server, but on the Windows workstation, I found 8 threats. I was able to click all of these threats, Trojans, malware, things of that nature, and I quarantined all of those files to make sure that those threats were mitigated. On the web server side, I used the same exact scanning the web server for vulnerabilities. And if we scroll down here, I did find a couple of things on the web server. So SSH, this version of OpenSSH, was vulnerable to a couple of different attacks. This is very common in the industry, this version 8.2, because the web server is Ubuntu 20.04 LTS and not the latest version of 22. It was vulnerable. This is the latest version of SSH that I could download. And then also this version of Apache was also vulnerable to the same specific attacks as the other, the version of Apache running on the Windows workstation. So for mitigation strategies, again, similar thing to the Windows workstation, upgrade to the latest version of SSH and Apache would be the #1 suggestion here to mitigate these vulnerabilities. I did use ClamAV as well to scan for malware and viruses. I found no infected files on the web server, so that is excellent. And then as far as documentation, I wanted to touch on just how the CIA triad was touched on here within the mitigations and the configurations that I was able to make to the network. So a couple of things are doing double duty here essentially and can go in different categories. So like I mentioned, security groups were created on the domain controller for departments. Folks within those departments were able to access or modify data that was only specific to their department. File shares were created and only employees with access could get into those specific file shares. Let's see. Password policy was in fact put into place. RDP was configured, absolutely. As far as integrity, firewall rules were in place to allow only SSH traffic from the Linux workstation to the web server. Did this by accessing the firewall, creating the proper rule. Multi-factor authentication was put in place as well. And then for availability, audit policy, collecting all the log files, ensuring all the data from users and systems are running properly, errors could be fixed, everything is living in those log files. So if we look and we see something that is fishy, we can go in and take a peek at that and fix those certain issues. The implemented mitigations from the vulnerabilities that I found. So on the Windows workstation, the version of Apache that was running on port 80 was vulnerable to attacks. So I downloaded a WAMP server stack. So it included a newer version of Apache 2.4.54, MySQL version 8.0.31, PHP 8026, and PHP So I uninstalled the version of Apache that was running and enabled this new WAMP server stack with a new version of Apache. So those vulnerabilities were mitigated, and you can see here proof that the current version of Apache running is this 2.4.54. And then I also made sure that I scanned with Malwarebytes. That is what I used for scanning malware and viruses. I made sure that everything was completed. No items were detected. So the items that I did quarantine were in fact still quarantined. And then on the web server side, this is where I ran into a little bit of an issue. So I made sure that OpenSSH and Apache were running the latest version that I was able to install with this version of Ubuntu 20.04. If we were to actually mitigate this strategy, I mean, using MFA will help a lot with SSH. So I think SSH is extremely secure the way it is. But we would have to update the operating system of the web server to Ubuntu 22.04 and download the most recent version of OpenSSH and Apache in order to mitigate these sorts of issues. So it is secure to the fullest extent that it can be at this point in time. So overall, this was a outstanding experience to be able to get my hands on this network, secure everything, configure everything that I was tasked with. I learned a lot about this organization. I think RPG is a wonderful, wonderful corporation. I think when it comes to expanding RPG to the newest location in Denton, Texas, that they're looking to expand to, I think implementing these security controls, making sure group policy is set and secure, anything that requires SSH has multi-factor authentication. All users have a secure password. That password policy is going to be huge, making sure that users aren't being compromised. Password spraying is extremely difficult for 14-character passwords that are complex. So there's a lot of things there that RPG can take in the future when trying to ensure that their data is protected from outside threats. So thank you very much for your time. I learned a lot about RPG. I had a blast with this internship, and I hope that I would be a wonderful candidate for the cybersecurity specialist position. Thank you so much. Have a great day.